Ikea has become the latest company, perhaps the most high profile, to give different rules for those who are unvaccinated among their staff as opposed to those who are vaccinated. They are going to cut sick pay down to your basic statutory sick pay for anyone who's unjabbed, who is forced to self-isolate, despite the fact they're not ill with COVID, but they've been a contact to someone with COVID and been traced on that basis. While the vaccinated, of course, can just simply keep taking lateral flow tests, and if they're negative, they can continue to come to work. Vaccinated, unvaccinated, different rules. What do you make of that?
Well, this is an employment contract. So first of all, the employment contract will be regulated by legal terms. And one of those terms will be whether or not that contract can be varied by the employer. If it can be varied, the employment contract can only be varied by for a good reason. And once that's done, any employee potentially could challenge that in the employment tribunal on the grounds that there was a disproportionate and unjustified variation of contract, even if the employer has the right to vary it unilaterally. One of the considerations they have to take into account, because it's every employer is bound by it, is the Equalities Act and the right against discrimination. And there are all sorts of people who would be indirectly discriminated against if there was one rule for vaccinated people and another one rule for not.
But what about people who say, well, hold on a minute, you're choosing to be discriminated against. This isn't someone being discriminated against because they've got a disability or they're a woman or they're black. This is someone choosing not to get a jab, and therefore they're choosing that discrimination. What would you say to that?
It's called indirect discrimination because it's indirect. So the effect of the policy is that some people will be disproportionately affected. People who have a religious objection, for example, because of some people say, and whether that's the case or not is not entirely clear, but some people say that there was fetal research into these vaccines and say Roman Catholics, some Muslims and some others will refuse to take it on that ground, or some of them will. Yeah. But they could have an objection on the basis that they are disabled, actually, because some people are unable to take the vaccine because of their long-term illness, and that's the definition of disability. And very, very much higher numbers of ethnic minorities, particularly black people, do not take the vaccine. So indirectly, that will affect them more. That's the meaning of indirect discrimination.
Okay. So just if the net effect is, for whatever reason, particularly hitting certain groups, then that has an issue. Let's talk about some of the other rules that we've got in place still. The masks in indoor spaces like supermarkets are still being enforced. Certainly in my local supermarket, there's staff who had claimed exemption, had COVID. They've been working in supermarkets throughout. They were, I think, some of the really unsung heroes in the first lockdown when people really were scared and we knew very little about this virus. They've been told they have to wear those masks all day, even if they've claimed an exemption. Those who have who've established a medical exemption are being forced to wear exemption lanyards. And I've spoken to a number of them. A lot of people really unhappy that actually the established rules like mask exemption and not being forced to declare it and forced to show evidence of it, these are being thrown out of the window this time round.
Yes, and again, that again is discrimination. If those people are disabled and if they have an exemption because they're disabled, that is a discriminatory policy, particularly if you're drawing attention to them unnecessarily through wearing a lanyard, but especially if the employer doesn't allow those individuals to have the exemption.
But you don't need to be disabled. I have an exemption from wearing a mask, as legal as anyone else's. I find it severely distressing to be forced to wear a pointless piece of cloth on my face. Therefore, I don't wear a mask, and I am under the law legally exempt. I don't have to provide proof to anyone other than, I think, a police officer or a court can ask to see that proof. But I'm not required to, under the law, to provide any proof other than my view, my personal feeling that I find it severely distressing, and those are the key words in the law, to wear a mask, which I do. Anyone can claim that exemption at any time.
Yes, the important point is also that to ask people why they are exempt requires them to give personal details and information in a public place, which is, again, discriminatory against those people who have an unseen disability or any form of disability that they will not want to reveal and do not need to reveal in public. And as you say, in fact, the government guidelines, only guidelines, but the government guidelines say you should not ask people why they are exempt.
Indeed. And masks in schools, of course, still there. And again, it's not actually the law. A lot of people think it is the law, and people who would be quite happy to have family gatherings, carrying on with normal life, sent their children into school wearing masks, where we know that schools are at no greater risk of spreading than anywhere else. This is well documented now in all the literature. But people think it's the law. It's not actually a legal requirement for your child to wear a mask at school.
No, and it is a legal requirement that schools respect parents who do not give consent to their children not wearing masks and not engaging in constant testing. Every parent has the right to refuse that, whether or not their child is exempt.
Okay, and so if someone says, just writes to the school saying, my child is exempt from the testing when they're still perfectly healthy, from wearing the mask, and the schools are required legally to accept that?
Yes.
Good advice. Very good to know. Francis Hoar, public law barrister, thank you very much indeed.